Okay. Hopefully this will be short and understandable directions to update your firmware on your barometer. So first thing we need to do is find the new firmware. If you go to github.com and just search Medphys Barometer, it should come up with my repository. The only thing that's really changed is main.py. So if you click on that, you'll see the new firmware written by myself, version 1.1. So if we download that and ignore the warnings, keep that file, we should have main.py in our downloads folder. That's all we need from GitHub. All the libraries are already on the barometer, so you don't need those, but what you do need is some software to upload the files with. I recommend Thonny. This is the software that's made by the MicroPython developers specifically for loading Python firmware onto the Raspberry Pi Pico. You, of course, are welcome to use whatever you would like, but you're on your own if you use something else. So download Thonny for your operating system and install it. And then once you run it, you should see something like this. Okay. So you should see something like this. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is connect it to your barometer. So use a micro USB cable, plug it into your computer, and plug it into your barometer with the barometer off. I recommend that you mostly leave the barometer off when you're connecting it to your computer. We'll talk about the exception here in a minute, but I think the connection is easier to get. Sometimes it's a little flaky if the barometer is already on when you try and connect the USB cable. Okay, so if everything went right, you should see in the bottom right hand corner of the Thonny window a new COM port called MicroPython on a Raspberry Pi Pico. The number COM3 might be different for you. We just want to click on that, and now it should say MicroPython on the Raspberry Pi Pico down here in the bottom right hand corner, and it should give you a new section here on the left that shows the files that are currently on the Raspberry Pi Pico. So if we load up the main file, this is your current firmware. These are your current calibration settings and your elevation for your clinic. We want to keep those, and it's not a bad idea to make a backup of your old firmware. And so what we can do is we can just take the main.py and save it as, on the Pi Pico, save it as main-old. Okay. Now you've got a main-old that has all of your calibration settings in it that won't get overwritten when you when you write new firmware to main.py. So that's good. And now we can load up the new firmware file, open from this computer, and we're going to find the downloads folder, find the new main.py, and open it. Okay. Now, you can't tell, but this main.py is still in my downloads folder. Okay. Before we save it onto the barometer, we want to transfer the calibration offsets. So I can copy that block right there and save it to the new firmware, and that transfers all of your calibration offsets from the old firmware to the new, so your calibrations should stay the same. It's not a bad idea to write down your temperature and pressure, today's temperature and pressure, before you do all this. So if you want to stop, unplug, and take a temperature and pressure measurement now, that might be a good idea. We still haven't loaded the new firmware onto the barometer yet, so this main.py is still your old firmware. It's just a copy of main-old, or I should say main-old is a copy of main.py. Okay, so you could unplug, turn the barometer on, take some temperature and pressure measurements, write them down, and then that'll give you a check just to make sure nothing changes when you update the firmware. Okay. And then plug it back in. Go back down here so let me do that. So I'm going to unplug. You'll notice we lost connection. I'm going to take a measurement, turn my barometer on. Today's pressure is 1027.7 and temperature is 19.4. Okay. Then I'll turn my barometer back off, plug it back in, and down in the bottom right hand corner I'll go back and reconnect to the Pi Pico. You'll notice none of this changed because it is not on the Pi Pico. Also, this didn't change because it's in memory in the editor. So, okay, so now we want to replace main.py that's on the barometer with the new version 1.1. Okay. And so all you have to do is go to File, Save As. We're going to save it to the Raspberry Pi Pico, and we're going to save it as main.py. And yes, we're going to overwrite. Okay, so this should now be loaded to the barometer. Now, just to double check and make sure that it is in fact loaded to the barometer and that we are dealing with the file that is on the Raspberry Pi Pico inside the barometer. Go ahead and close it, close everything, and just double click on main.py in the Raspberry Pi Pico window. That ensures that every change that we do here is going to then save to the Pico and not to the downloads folder or something, or some other place. Okay, we have one other change we need to do, and it's fairly significant, but we're going to need to run the barometer while it's connected in order to get the values that we need. Okay, so if we stop whatever's running on the Raspberry Pi Pico and then run the current script, that's going to run main.py from Pi Pico, and you'll notice that the lcd.py is failing, and that's because we didn't turn on the barometer. So the LCD is not powered on, so it can't connect, so it can't communicate with the Raspberry Pi. So that's fine. So what we do is we hit stop again. We turn the barometer on while it's still connected. The screen is going to come up with black squares. That's fine, because we don't have software running on it yet. And then we can run our software and then stop it. Now, let's run it again. What happens when I run it is it's going to output some calibration values, and then it's going to start outputting temperatures and pressures. Okay, so depending on how long you let it go before you stop, you might have to scroll back up to get the calibration values. And these calibration values down here in the shell come from the BMP280 chip that is on your specific barometer. Okay. These values up here need to be edited to match what is in your barometer. So I'm going to take T1 from the shell output, that came from my barometer, and I'm going to type it in to T1, the T1 check value, 27810. And I'm going to continue on and do that for all of my check values. Okay, all the values have to be the same, and it needs to be from the bottom window to the top window. Okay, looks like we're good. Just a quick double check. T1 is 27810, T2 26205, T3 -1000, P1 37758, P2 -10928, 3024, 5037, 172, -7, 1550, 15500, 155, 00, 14600, and 6000. Okay, so if I've correctly copied the bottom values to the top, this should run without error. You should notice, since we haven't yet saved this new firmware to the barometer, that it says P280 cal failure on your barometer. That's because these values did not match these values when we just ran it. And that's that's just an error check that I do on the P280, because it can sometimes load its internal calibration values incorrectly. So so we type them in manually to the firmware, and then every time it loads, it'll check these values against those. Okay, so now if we then save and run it again, our cal failure should have gone away, and now we have a regular screen on our barometer. Okay. And that should be all you have to do. We're done. If you want to double check against your measured values pre-update, you can unplug, you can turn your barometer off, you can turn your barometer back on and read the pressure and temperature and make sure that it's consistent with the pressure and temperature you measured a few minutes ago. So the primary differences between version 1.1 and the previous release, version 1.0, is that I've added this check in. What that means is each time you build a new barometer, you're going to have to enter these values in. You shouldn't have to change these at all next time you run this. But if you were to update your firmware again, you would want to copy this entire code block to customize your firmware to your specific chip. And then you won't, these values are specific to each individual sensor, so every barometer is different. Okay. And then the other thing I changed is I added in the pressure display routine, I added a check from the get pressure. So we'll go back. So get pressure will output the difference between the two sensors. If you have a 280 and a 390, like is the standard for this particular barometer, The 390 is a nicer sensor, and the 280 is there for redundancy, so you can do a check against each other. It outputs this difference, and then before I display, I check and make sure the difference is less than 200 pascals. So as long as the difference between the two sensors is less than 200 pascals, we're going to run normally. If it's more than that, if one of the sensors has drifted, then it's going to tell you there's a pressure difference error and point you to page 4 where you can see the two raw readings from the two sensors. And then this is the cal failure in case the check against all of these fails. So if it loads any of these incorrectly and it doesn't match what we've just entered in, it'll give you that cal failure. And that's all there is to it. It's not a bad idea to write down these values somewhere permanent. So that you have those in a physical copy as well. And that's all.